Earlier this year, I bought the Samsung Galaxy Tab S8 to replace my iPad mini. And I've had Samsung and other Android tablets in the past, but it's fair to say that for the last 5 years, I've been mainly using iPads. But I really like this tablet. I use it regularly and I'm very happy with my purchase. Part of the reason for buying it though was that there's a specific question I wanted to answer. Does performance actually matter as much as we think it does in the real world? When I bought the S8, the iPad Air had the A14 chip in it, which offers considerably more CPU horsepower than the S8. But I had a feeling that in real world usage, you probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference. Great idea for a video, right? But then a couple of weeks later, Apple updated the iPad Air with the M1 chip. And so here we are now 9 months down the line and I'm only just getting around to making the video. The Samsung Galaxy Tab S8 and the iPad Air are similarly priced tablets, but now they have an even wider performance gap. I guess that question becomes even more important. Does that extra performance really matter? Are you going to notice the deficit on the S8? Let's discuss. Now let's start off with graphics performance, particularly from a gaming perspective. If you use your tablet for gaming, then you will definitely notice the performance gaps between the S8 and the M1 equipped iPads, and even more to the M2 in the latest iPad Pro models. Before we look at the figures, it's probably just worth stating though that the S8 is available in 3 different sizes, and this is the smallest at 11 inches. You then have the S8 Plus at 12.4 inches, and that whopping S8 Ultra at 14.6 inches. All 3 tablets have the same chip, and from what I can see, the same number of CPU cores and the same GPU. To test against the S8, I've got the A14 equipped iPad Air, so that's the previous generation model. I don't have one of the M1 iPad Airs, but I do have an M1 iPad Pro, so we'll use that to run some tests on. The M1 Air's performance would be similar because it shares the same chip, but the difference here is the Pro has 16 gigabytes of RAM, and I expect that would help performance. So maybe the M1 iPad Air would score slightly lower than this tablet does. And we've set up the 3 tablets to get started with the 3D Mark Wildlife Extreme test. It's called Extreme because it's rendering at UHD 4K resolution, and most tablet games won't be pushing the graphics performance this hard. And here are the results. The M1 iPad Pro manages a score of 5,104 at 30.6 frames per second. The A14 iPad Air scores 2,497 at 14.9 frames per second. And the S8 scores 2,466 at 14.8 frames per second. So if you want a tablet for gaming, then the M1 iPad has got more raw GPU horsepower. And that gap only gets wider when you compare the M2 chip, which of course is already in the Pro iPads, and that has 50% more GPU performance. But the performance of the S8 here in this test is basically identical to the previous generation iPad Air with the A14. Of course, the A14 iPad Air has been superseded by the M1 version, which has way more graphics performance. So if you go and buy one today, then the iPad Air is going to be the winner. And because of that, it's difficult to make an argument for the S8 over the iPad if you're purely focused on gaming. Now, incidentally, folks always ask me what stands I'm using to put these tablets on, so let me just mention those. The S8 here is on a generic stand from a company called Pepperjobs. I've got a couple of these things, they're really useful to have. The iPad Pro over here is on the MagFlött from CharJenPro, and I reviewed that previously on the channel. We'll pop a link up here. The iPad Air is on a new stand from Quizlab. It's fully aluminium and it's got this built-in hub on it. So I'll be doing a review on that stand very soon. So if you want to see that, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. And also I'll put some links in the description for these stands. Now though, let's take a look at some CPU comparisons using Geekbench 5. This is a cross-platform benchmark that tests both single-core and multi-core performance of the CPU. And here are the results for single-core performance. The M1 iPad Pro scores 1,685. You would expect the M1 iPad Air to score identically to that. The A14 iPad Air manages 1,587, and the S8 is some way behind at 1,214. Now, you're typically going to notice single-core performance in everyday tasks, especially web browsing, and so these results don't look especially great for the S8, but we need to get some context here. These iPad scores are actually very high. Those sort of scores are what you might expect from a fast, modern PC. whereas the S8 score of 1214 is actually a good score, and it's plenty enough to deliver a solid tablet experience. And here we have the multi-core results. The M1 iPad Pro manages 7,193. Again, you can expect the same sort of performance from the M1 iPad Air. The A14 iPad Air scores 4,316, and the S8 lags behind again at 3,355. Again, we find a big performance gap for the Samsung S8 when it comes to multi-threaded performance. But just how evident this gap is in the real world on a tablet operating system is another question. There's no denying, though, that the S8 has a long way to go to catch even the previous generation iPad Air with its A14 chip, and it is miles behind the M1. But let's get back to my question at the outset. Does that actually matter in real-world usage? You see, I've been using this tablet for almost 9 months, and it has always felt smooth and responsive in that time. And I'd say my usage is typical of most tablet users. I'm browsing the web, I'm taking notes, streaming video and audio content, making video calls, and running a few niche apps for my hobbies and interests. And of course, I'm using it to interact with social media. Naturally, I've also been using the iPads to do all of those same tasks. So can I do them faster on an iPad? Not necessarily. At least it's not CPU performance that makes the main difference here. It's the operating system. And I don't want to wade into the whole Android versus iPadOS debate, because there are pros and cons to each platform and you can pick your favourite. It can be really difficult to separate subjective opinion from objective fact when you're comparing platforms like this. And whenever you praise one platform or the other, there always seems to be a reaction from the fanboys. So I'm just going to say that I like both systems for different reasons. I am more familiar with iPadOS, and so I do need to be careful that I don't allow that familiarity to bias my opinion. Now, as an example, here is a subjective opinion. For me, I prefer the Android on-screen keyboard to the one that's on the iPad. Now, whilst that is a subjective opinion, there is a point to it, because if I get on better with the keyboard on one tablet or the other, that could be the factor that speeds me up or slows me down, rather than the performance of the CPU. But let's now take a look at the real-world performance by putting the S8 side by side with the M1 iPad, and we're going to load up a complex Excel spreadsheet. This spreadsheet has got a lot of numbers in it, it's got some graphs in it, it's referencing multiple different sheets, multiple different data points. So let's just get onto a sheet with all the figures, and yeah, scrolling is nice and smooth on the S8, possibly a slight bit of lag, buttery smooth as you'd expect on the M1 iPad Pro. It's got a lot more performance on offer, but that's completely usable. Let's choose something that has a graph in it as well. So I don't think there's any denying here. You could probably see the speed difference. The M1 in the iPad Pro is, of course, a very powerful chip, and it's running this spreadsheet without any issues whatsoever. The S8 is definitely a bit more laggy. It's not giving that super buttery smooth experience. But if you were to take the iPad out of the equation and just use the S8 in isolation, you'd probably be completely happy with this performance. It's perfectly usable. I could work with this quite happily. And I've seen this particular spreadsheet running much worse on laptop computers. Side-by-side comparisons are pretty useful if you're looking to purchase a device, but of course, once you've got it, you don't typically use your device side-by-side with some other competing platform. So differences that you see in a test like this aren't really relevant, provided that the device you're using is performing its tasks well. If the device does the job you want it to do, it's smooth and it's responsive, do you really care whether some other device somewhere else might be marginally smoother or slightly more responsive? Probably not. Let's just try another real-world example with doing some basic web browsing. So what I've done is I've just loaded up the Sky News website. It's quite a busy website. There's a lot going on. This can be a bit of a challenge for some devices. Let's just refresh the page. We do have a really fast internet connection here. You can see the page loads nice and quickly. Very smooth scrolling on the iPad and also on the S8. I have to say there is a difference between Android and iPadOS when it comes to scrolling. iPadOS has that sort of really smooth acceleration that Android doesn't have. But putting that difference aside, it feels very responsive. Let's load up a story. Take the top story. You can see both tablets load quickly. Video loads up, images, adverts coming in. I can't really see a lot of difference between the performance of both of them. Let's try another story. You see, when it comes to web browsing on most of the sites that you're going to access, the Samsung S8 has plenty of performance and gives a comparable experience to using an iPad, even an iPad with an M1 chip and 16 gigs of RAM. Now let's compare this experience with an actual web benchmark. We ran the Web Expert 3 browser benchmark using the default browser for each tablet. So that's Safari on the iPads and the Samsung browser on the S8. I think many users will be just using the default browser, so it's probably the fairest way to do the test. But we will also run it in Chrome on each tablet. This benchmark simulates all sorts of web-based tasks, including some image manipulation. It's not necessarily representative of web browsing habits on a tablet, but it is an interesting metric to have a look at. And here are the results. So the M1 iPad Pro using Safari scores 254. The A14 iPad Air scores 205, and the S8 manages 145. So let's just run the test again with Google Chrome. And the M1 iPad Pro scores 254, so exactly the same score as it managed in Safari. The A14 iPad Air managed 207, which again is basically the same. But the S8 scores 120, which is quite a bit worse. So I guess maybe the moral of the story here is to use the default Samsung browser on your S8 tab. Now you might imagine from the benchmark results that the S8 is going to deliver a vastly inferior web browsing experience, but in the real world, it doesn't. And this is really my point. The S8 series is a fantastic tablet that offers a great real-world user experience. On devices like this, for the tasks that we commonly perform, CPU performance is not as relevant as we might think it is, providing that everything is good enough to deliver that great real-world experience that we need. And remember that hardware is only part of the experience. Software will have a much bigger impact on how you feel about your tablet. If you prefer Android, the S8 is a brilliant choice, but if you prefer iPadOS, then there's no point in buying a Samsung tablet, is there? All of the iPads will give you that great iPad experience, even the entry-level iPad, which in itself underlines the point I'm trying to make. You can go and buy the last generation standard iPad and you'll be getting the same great iPad experience as someone who's buying the latest M1 iPad Air. Yes, of course, there are niche areas where performance matters and your gaming experience will be different. But for most people, using a tablet the way that most people do, it may not be as important as we think. And here's another kicker and possibly the motivation for this video in the first place. iPadOS can actually fully utilize the full performance of the M1 or M2 chips, with the exception of a couple of niche apps and again excluding gaming. Most iPad apps don't come anywhere near stretching the performance of the M chips, and that's why the benchmark results just don't matter as much as you might think, and why in the real world these tablets all end up feeling pretty similar. Cost is another thing that we need to consider. In the UK, the S8 is currently £649. That includes 128 gigs of storage and the S Pen. The iPad Air starts at £669 for 64 gigs of storage, but the Apple Pencil will set you back another £139. So here in the UK, the Galaxy Tab S8 is the cheaper tablet. There are some differences apart from the chips inside. The display in the S8 gets a 120Hz LCD panel. I think the larger S8 tablets get an AMOLED screen. The iPad Air, this is also an LCD panel, but it's 60Hz, and that might matter to you if you're a keen stylus user. And you could argue that the display is the most important hardware feature of a tablet rather than the chip inside. So when you balance the display into the overall equation, the value proposition of the S8 versus the iPad Air is still actually favourable. There are other specification differences that we haven't covered, and I'm really interested to compare the ports on these tablets to see how they perform. But what I didn't want to do is overcomplicate this video and lose track of the key points, so maybe we'll cover that in a future video. So, does performance matter on a tablet? Does something like the S8 still make sense when Apple is selling iPads with crazy powerful M1 and M2 chips? I think I would have to say that performance doesn't matter up to a point. The S8 as a tablet is powerful enough for this not to matter for the majority of users, and that means that it is worth considering as an alternative for some people. Now, of course, these devices aren't cheap, so it's important to try them out before you buy if you can. And if you can't, I hope I've given you some helpful information to contribute to that decision. But of course, I do recommend that you watch as many reviews as you can. Please share your thoughts and opinions in the comments. Which of these tablets do you think is the winner? Which one would you buy? Thanks as always for supporting the channel with your subs, your likes, even your dislikes. And thank you for using our affiliate links in the description. I am really very grateful. See you again soon for some more geekery.